Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one the Ukrainians are launching some local counterattacks to regain some positions and strengthen their fortified areas around the city of Pokrovsk and in the Kursk region. In the Kursk region, the Ukrainians managed to recapture some positions along the Loknya river line, securing the village agglomeration alongside it. In the east of Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians managed to recapture a town, and to the south of Pokrovsk, they are working to regain control over Dashne. The Ukrainians were pushed back to the west of Korokhove within Andriivka, and the Russians managed to advance further towards the intersection east of Pokrovsk. Starting out in the eastern section of the front line, the Russians managed to advance slightly within Andriivka, moving towards the fortified positions north of the town. The Russians have secured the highway all the way to the central parts of the town. From here, they're looking to advance towards Konstantinopel from the north, the western outskirts of Andriivka, and up towards the fortified positions, both from the northern outskirts in a western direction and from the central parts in a northern direction. Target from two different directions, and with control over the highway area, the Russians may look to expand westwards to flank these fortified positions from the north as well, to squeeze the Ukrainian forces out by pushing from all three directions and forcing the Ukrainians back towards Oleksivka and out of Andriivka. To the north, in the southern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians were pushed back within the town of Dashenske, where the Ukrainians are launching some offensive operations. It seems that the Ukrainians are here looking to secure the southern flank of the river line. This allows them to have full control over the northern flank by attacking towns such as Selene, and to regain control over the forest patches and fortified positions north of Shevchenko, where we've seen some attempted Ukrainian counterattacks both in the direction of Pishane and Shevchenko to attempt to regain control over these areas. The Ukrainians are launching a general counterattack in the Pokrovsk direction, both to the south of the city and also in the eastern direction, where they are attempting to push back the Russian forces from the siege of the city to re-secure main supply lines such as the highway and railway to the west of Pokrovsk in the direction of the city of Zaporizhia, to regain control over important outposts and strongholds such as Shevchenko and Pishane, and to regain control over the river line to the south of the city. All of this is an attempt to slow down the Russian siege of the city. The Ukrainians have been trying to slow down the Russian offensive operations as much as possible over the past few months. However, we are now seeing a switch where the Ukrainians are moving on to the offensive. This is likely a result of the Russians focusing their efforts elsewhere, such as in the direction of Korokhove and Velika Novosilka. Yet we also see that the Russians have not really reduced their efforts in the Pokrovsk direction. It has been at a sustainable rate. However, the Ukrainians seem to have gathered new forces, new reinforcements to launch these counterattacks, as the Ukrainians do not work in a sustainable way. Instead, what they do is they concentrate forces in one direction in an attempt to gain an advantage in that direction to achieve some results, and then continuously do this in different sectors of the front line. And it seems that in the Pokrovsk direction and in the Kursk direction are the main efforts by the Ukrainians right now. The Chasiv Yar direction is also seeing a lot of activity by the Ukrainian forces, where they're trying to regain some positions and lift the siege of the central parts of the city. However, they are unable to achieve anything so far this month in Chasiv Yar, but they are receiving some success and some results in the Pokrovsk direction and in the Kursk direction. To the east of Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians managed to recapture the town of Vodyane-Druhe, and the Russians at the same time launched an attack to gain control over the farm area to the west of Vodyane-Druhe, fighting over the fortified positions both at the outskirts of Vodyane-Druhe as well as in the northeastern flank of Yelisavetivka. The Ukrainians recently recaptured Yelisavetivka, and the Russians are flanking it from the south, and with the attack from the western direction through the north of Vostyshenka, the Russians are looking to flank Yelisavetivka both from the southern and northern directions and putting it in a pincer, while the Ukrainians managed to push the Russians away from some of the positions to the south and within Vodyane-Druhe. The Russians are looking to advance alongside the main river line here to the east of Vodyane-Druhe towards the main supply line into the pocket of Ukrainian forces in the fortified positions north of Avdiivka. The Ukrainians are here working to inflict as many casualties as possible on the Russian forces, forcing some rotations among their forces and redirecting their equipment from other sections of the front line or from the Russian reserve. And the objective is to slow down the Russian offensive operations, but also to limit the ability to expand their zone of control. Talk of a Russian offensive in the Kharkiv region would necessitate the Ukrainians inflicting casualties on the Russians in other sectors of the front line to prevent such an operation from taking place. To explain it in simple terms, let's imagine that the Russians have 10,000 soldiers in reserve, where they are planning an offensive operation into the Kharkiv region. If the Ukrainians use up some of their forces to launch some counterattacks in the Pokrovsk direction and inflict casualties on the Russian forces, then the Russian forces can use these forces to rotate their forces and then gain the upper hand again in the Pokrovsk direction and strengthen their offensive operations in the area. But this would deny and cancel this Kharkiv operation and delay it a few weeks or months. This would mean that the Russian forces in this case would strengthen their offensive operation in the Pokrovsk direction and likely speed up their gains in the coming weeks following the Ukrainian counterattack, as the Ukrainians would expend some of their equipment and forces that are needed for defense. But it would also mean that the Kharkiv section of the front line is more secure and the Ukrainians can continue their operations in the Kursk region. Therefore, we see that the effects and the operations in one section of the front line affects all the other sections of the front line. But again, the more the Ukrainians counterattack, the more that they use up their forces, the quicker they will be running low on their equipment and forces, and the faster the Russians would be advancing. And to properly understand how this affects the front line, we'd have to know the casualty numbers and the balance of power. However, both of these are unknown. There's only rough estimates and weird information, such as the Ukrainians sometimes claiming the Russians outnumber them 3-1 or 5-1. But that would be in an instant, in a specific battle, in a specific area, which is insignificant in terms of a complete front line, where the balance of power is more likely 1-1 or 2-1, and that is much more negligible, especially in terms of whether the Ukrainians can launch some counterattacks. They just need to relocate forces from different parts and then focus them in one area, and that will allow them to gain a local advantage and then launch this attack. But this also means that they'll be taking more casualties during this attack, and if the Russians take advantage of that, they'll be able to regain positions and potentially capture more, improving their positions, and then the battle over the city begins. And that is the sort of situation we see right now. The Ukrainians are counterattacking both to the east, to the west, and to the south of Pokrovsk, which is an ambitious operation. If they succeed with these attacks, they will be able to secure the city in multiple areas. However, if they fail, it would mean that the Russians would be able to enter the city itself, and the siege of it would speed up instead. And this is why it's really just a gamble on whether you will be able to succeed and gain more benefits from this operation than not. But an alternative could also be that they would be launching these operations knowing that they are extremely difficult and take a lot of losses, but as long as they also inflict a lot of losses on the Russian forces, then the Russians would not have the necessary strength to launch offensive operations, and therefore they would still be in a position where they'll be slowing down the Russian advance. In the Kursk section of the front line, the Ukrainians launched some counterattacks there as well, where they managed to regain control over Viktorovka and some of the forest lines and forest patches outside of these villages alongside the Loknya river line. The Russian forces managed to gain a foothold in some of these areas and secure some of the fortified positions. Now the Ukrainians are trying to recapture these positions and secure the area yet again. The Russians managed to capture the majority of the forest patch area and the pocket to the northwest of this village agglomeration. At the same time, this geolocated footage confirms Russian capture of some of the forest patch area in the northern parts of Sverdlikovo and the foothold of Russian forces within the town. Following the capture of the fortified positions at the end of last month, we see fighting taking place along Sverdlikovo, along the border area between Russia and Ukraine. The Russians are attempting to expand their zone of control in the western parts of Sochia and to reach Sochia from the western direction, where only Sverdlikovo and Lebedivka stands between the Russian forces and Sochia from the Koronevo direction, while the Ukrainian forces are attempting to take advantage of these offensive operations in the direction of Russian forces by launching some counterattacks to regain some control over the village agglomeration. It seems that the Russians are focused on the prize, which is Sudzha, with the Ukrainian counterattack in the southern flank of Sudzha in the few past days. The Russians have been kicked out of the town agglomeration itself, but with capture of Sverdlikovo and Lebedivka, the Russians would be able to attack Sudzha in a pincer maneuver from the northern and southern directions at the same time, and therefore the Russians may look to launch a new offensive operation soon to capture Lebedivka and Sverdlikovo, gain full control of those two towns, will allow the Russians to reach the outskirts of Sudzha here in the Kursk region, and battle over Sudzha would be the final battle over the Kursk region. In the end, what we're seeing is that there's a lot more back and forth this year than the last year. The Russians started out with a weak month of January where they did not advance as much as they did at the end of 2024. And now the Ukrainians are looking to do some counterattacks. It seems that the Ukrainians may be planning a spring offensive, similar to what they did last year, and to improve their positions across several sectors of the front line as they build up some reserve forces to launch a counterattack. However, as we saw with the previous year and the former year in both 2023 and 2024, the success of these operations have, however, been very limited, as Russians have now established proper defensive lines across several sectors of the front line. The Kursk region has significant fortified areas, the Belgorod region has significant fortified areas, and so has the entire eastern and southern section of the front line. Even the Bryansk region has seen several fortified positions being built over the past year, and this means that the Ukrainians' goal would be to achieve another operation with an element of surprise to gain some initial advantage. However, it is unlikely that another offensive into Russian territory or Ukrainian offensive in general would be very successful due to an element of surprise, because the Russians are spreading the forces out across several sectors of the front line. So in conclusion, what we are seeing is that the Russians, with these defensive lines being built and new forces being recruited, are able to completely defend the entire section of the front line and have the necessary forces to do so, which limits the possibility of a successful Ukrainian offensive. And the Ukrainians are really scraping the barrel at this point in terms of manpower and equipment that they have available. Depending on how the negotiations between Trump, Zelensky, and Putin go, and depending on whether the US will really double down on Ukraine, send additional equipment and weapons, and increase the sanctions on Russia, this seems like 2025 may be the last year of the war, whether negotiated or through battle. At the same time, we may even see it extend into 2026 as well, if the US and Russia do not reach any sort of agreement and the US doubles down on Ukraine. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.